Hello there. Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Today, we're joined for a fireside chat with Congressman David Cicilline, the United States Representative for the state of Rhode Island, 1st Congressional District since 2011. Representative Cicilline, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Without further ado, let's start with the fiery speech that you gave on the House floor regarding what you called Banning Kids from School Sports Act. As you know, the debate over transgender rights has become increasingly contentious in recent years, with many states passing legislation that restrict access to healthcare and other services for transgender individuals. What is your take on this, and what steps do you believe we need to be taking to address some of these issues that have been boiling at the national conversation?
Well, the first thing I would say is they're boiling in the national conversation because the Republican Party has decided that this is a smart political strategy. They did polling and they figured out that they needed to replace marriage equality, which they used in the last campaign cycle, with a new issue to kind of mobilize their base and activate their base. And their poll told them that trans kids was the right target. And so they have tried to prevent some kids from participating in school sports. We all know school sports are really important for kids. It teaches you about teamwork. It teaches you about achieving a goal, focusing on good health and exercise and working to achieve an objective. So there's all kinds of things which young people learn from school sports. And every child should have the opportunity to participate in school sports. And Republicans passed legislation to try to prevent, or that would prevent, young trans kids from participating in school sports. It was a terrible bill. They think it will help them politically win elections, but it's wrong, fundamentally unfair. And I think most people understand, you shouldn't be mean to kids, and kids shouldn't be discriminated against. And anyone who wants to play school sports should get to play them, period.
Okay. And so you believe that this is a bandwagon that they jumped on because it can help them score political points rather than having any legitimate reason for doing this?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. In fact, there was a great piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, front page story, that basically, the organizers around this issue acknowledged that they did poll testing, that they discovered that this was something which would really gin up their base. And they've used it not only in Congress, but all across the country. State legislatures are passing and bills are being introduced to attack and discriminate against trans people. And, this is a community that's part of the larger LGBTQ plus community. But the Republicans see this as a very advantageous politically. But I think they're going to pay a political price for it. I think most Americans don't think discrimination is good. They think everyone should be treated fairly, and they think all kids should get to play sports.
And you've talked often about holding public officials accountable for anti-LGBTQA rhetoric. How do we do that?
We vote them out of office. Look, we passed the Equality Act, which is legislation I introduced and authored in the House, which prohibits discrimination in all important areas of life based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We passed it twice in the House. We've yet to get the Senate to take it up. But every single Democrat voted for the Equality Act in the last Congress, and only 2 Republicans. So we should not elect people who are not committed to equality for all Americans. Discrimination is wrong. Equality is a fundamental building block and the foundation of our democracy. And I hope the way we respond to this is by not electing people who believe discrimination against the LGBTQ community is okay. It's un-American. And the way you hold them accountable is throw them out of office.
And what does this say about our fellow countrymen who constantly keep putting the same bigots or so in office?
Well, I think that what it says is very often they don't know what their member of Congress is doing on this issue. A majority of voters in every single state in America support non-discrimination protections for the LGBTQ community. And a majority of Americans, almost 2/3, support non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. So this is widely popular with the American people. The only place it remains controversial is in the Republican caucus in the House. And it's really a moment when Congress has to catch up to where the American people are. But I think, more and more people are learning and understanding what their members of Congress position is on issues. And I think when they learn that they don't support equality for our community, they'll be encouraged not to send them back to Congress.
Okay, and then often the people in the Republican Party frame the issue of transgender rights or LGBTQ rights as protecting our children, protecting our youth and our values. Whereas you stood on the floor and you've talked about if you want to protect our youth, gun control is the way to
Yeah,
do
I
it.
mean, it's one of the most terrible tropes against the LGBTQ community, the idea of protecting your youth. What we were
Right.
talking about in that bill is young trans kids and about protecting them. This idea that somehow you're going to be endangered by your child playing on a team with a trans kid. You know, as I said in the thing, what parents are really worried about is their kids being gunned down in the school because our colleagues in the Republican side refuse to pass any gun safety legislation. That's the real threat. That's the thing that my constituents really worry about. They don't worry about their kids playing field hockey with a trans kid on the team. They're, you know, sadly, it is now the case that the leading cause of death for America's children is gun violence.
Let's
And
talk
yet-
about that some more. Just as of today, there was another mass shooting in Atlanta, but this time in an emergency room. And so there has been about 192 mass shootings across the country. And you've been
This year.
this year. And you've been an ardent advocate on gun reform and gun control. Could you elaborate a bit more on this issue?
Yes. We have a gun violence epidemic in this country. It's a public health pandemic. It's a crisis. It's the leading cause of deaths for children in America is gun violence. We've had more mass shootings than days in the year. They have become so routine that begin to kind of lose the shock that they should bring to all of us. They've happened in schools and movie theaters and shopping malls and synagogues and churches and hospital emergency room now. And this is a peculiarly American problem. There's no country in the world that has the level of gun violence that we have, other than maybe Sudan, that's in the middle of a civil war practically. I mean, it's a peculiar American problem. And it's an American problem because this is a country flooded with guns. And, you know, very often my Republican colleagues will talk about mental health. I'm a big believer we have to do everything we can to keep people healthy and keep guns out of the hands of people who have serious mental health issues. Those are called red flag laws. Our Republican colleagues don't support those either. But the truth is, our level of mental health challenges are no different than the rest of the developed world.
Right.
And yet we have a level of gun violence which is unmatched. Why? Because there are more guns than people in this country. And so until we pass legislation that will make it more impossible for dangerous people to get guns, that will ban assault weapons, which were weapons that were designed for war, with one purpose, to kill as many people as quickly as you can. They don't belong in our neighborhoods. They don't belong in our communities. We ought to have red flag laws that allow anyone who thinks there is evidence that someone is a danger to themselves or others, they go to court and be able to prevent that person from buying a gun. We ought to ban ghost guns. These are guns that can be just produced at home from a kit that don't have serial numbers, that are the single greatest problem for law enforcement because you can't trace them. There are dozens of bills we have to reduce gun violence in this country, and yet our Republican colleagues will not agree to one single measure. Universal background checks. We know background checks work. Every year, more than 1 million gun sales are denied because people try to buy a gun who don't have a right to buy a gun because they have a criminal record, or they have a serious mental illness. So we know background checks work. The problem is there are thousands of gun sales that happen with no background check because they happen at a gun show or they happen in private sale. So universal background checks will help keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. We can't even get our Republican colleagues to support that. And so again, I think this is where the MAGA Republican Party is out of step with where the American people are. The American people want to be able to send their kids to school and not worry about whether they're going to come home alive.
Right. And so you speak about disconnect between the American people and the people who are making the decisions, the lawmakers in Washington. And so there is, putting the politics aside for a bit, how do we begin to convince some of the people in the far right that safeguarding the livelihoods of our children is not the same thing as infringing on your rights?
Yeah, look, I think there are some people on the far right who believe that you cannot restrict or limit in any way the ability to possess any kind of firearm you want whenever you want.
And those are not the people you're
just not going to
speaking
change our people's mind.
Right.
You need to vote them out of office.
Okay.
And I think we need to elect people who are committed to doing everything that is humanly possible to reduce gun violence in this country. President Obama once said, the problem we have is for our voters who believe in responsible gun safety legislation, we've got to become single issue voters.
Right.
For us, it's on the list with education and reproductive freedom and non-discrimination protections and voting rights and reducing gun violence. Like, it's on the list.
Right.
For people on the opposite side,
That's the only thing.
That's it. It's the one thing
that they vote
And
on.
I think President Obama is right. This needs to become a single issue vote. We have to say, I will not vote for someone who does not commit to supporting common sense measures to reduce gun violence in this country. If we do that, we'll elect different people and we can finally pass these laws.
I think your hand is right on the money, as like messaging matters, especially for my generation. And I feel like too often the Democratic Party loses a lot of people through their messaging. And it feels like a bit too virtuous rather than focusing on the thing that it is that will get me to buy into the party, to buy into the idea of whatever it is they're trying to sell me. Whereas Republicans will take one issue and drive that home for the rest of the year. And that would be the only thing that's being repeated and recycled through the media over and over again. So like that's the only thing at the forefront of our minds. But to pivot a little bit, the indictment of former President Trump has raised significant questions about the role of the executive branch in our democracy. What is your perspective on this issue? And what steps do you think we can take to ensure that no one, regardless of their political power, is above the law?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do is to make sure that when we tell young school children that the one thing that's different in America is that no one is above the law and everyone is required to follow the same set of rules and will be punished if they violate those rules, that has to also apply to people even as powerful as the President of the United States. There are presidents all across the world who engage in wrongdoing. They get away with it because they were the president. But America's different. We tell everyone, no one in America is above the law. This is a country of laws, not of individuals. And the best way to make sure that that's true is to be certain that the former president of the United States, like any other person who's done something wrong, is held accountable. And we have a system of justice that does that where ordinary citizens come together and form something called a grand jury.
Right.
And they deliberate and they make a determination as to whether or not there's enough evidence to support a finding that the person committed a crime. They issue an indictment. And we should respect the rule of law and respect the judgment of the individuals who made that decision. Like any other criminal defendant, the former president is entitled to be presumed innocent and entitled to all of the due process. But this is an important victory for the rule of law in this country. We need to all support it.
Okay. Thank you for that take. And then speaking of people at the top, people with power being held accountable, let's talk about ethics and the Supreme Court.
Or the lack of ethics.
Or the lack of ethics. The Justice Clarence Thomas is facing backlash for taking trips and offers from his millionaire and billionaire friends. What is your take on that? How do we ensure that the people who are in charge of ensuring or the highest levels of standards of ethics in this country are held to the same standards that they hold everybody else to?
The first thing I would say is that this is no longer, in my view, a question about ethics. This is a question about corruption. And, ethics is too gentle of a word. The United States Supreme Court is extraordinarily powerful. It has the ability to make decisions that directly impact the lives of the American people. We've seen it as they've ripped away the right for a woman to have access to abortion services. We've seen it as they ripped away protections for voting rights. We've seen it as they've, issued decision after decision that refuse to allow states to take reasonable measures to reduce gun violence. So it has enormous power. And they are appointed to those positions for life. And they are the only federal judges in America that are not governed by an ethics code because they refuse to do so. And we have legislation that would require the United States Supreme Court to adopt an ethics code and then follow it. But there are, judicial ethics that at least require them to disclose a certain financial interest that might affect their ability to be impartial, and they're required to recuse themselves from cases. But of course, if there's no disclosure, it's hard to know if they've made the right judgments. And I think these recent revelations about Justice Thomas, where he is receiving financial support through vacations and cruises and hundreds of thousands of dollars in value unreported by someone who's not just a friend, but a major Republican far-right conservative donor who's essentially trying to reshape American democracy through the judiciary. And this is, one of the reasons the Supreme Court has the lowest approval rating it has had in its history, or at least in modern times. And so the legitimacy of the court is really being undermined by this conduct. And I think the Supreme Court is in crisis, and the Chief Justice ought to announce immediately the adoption of an ethics code and ought to promulgate some rules that if you don't follow the ethics code, there will be consequences. But this is a terrible time for the court.
And so,
and by the way, it feeds into this incredible cynicism that people have about government. It's like even the Supreme Court, which you always thought was, above, beyond reproach. These were the
black
most
robes.
revered black robes. Even they can't be trusted to do what's right, and they're in their self-dealing and advancing that. Justice Thomas is there, doing these videos where he says, I prefer to be at a Walmart parking lot with people from Walmart. I'm just a regular guy. And in the meantime, he's on mega yachts, gifts of a billionaire, experiencing the world in such a different way. It's disgraceful.
And so you've mentioned corruption. So now we have to talk about Congress and the Senate. And so there are studies that show that there is congruency between what major millionaire and billionaire donors want and what laws and policies are passed. So then if we're talking about holding the Supreme Court to high levels of standards, how do we make sure that we are holding Congress and the Senate to high levels of standard? Because right now it seems like it's scratch my back and I scratch your back kind of thing happening.
I think it's actually something even worse than that. Look, we have a lot of evidence that what the American people want to happen doesn't happen in terms of legislation being passed. We still, have the highest prescription drug prices in the world. People want lower prescription drug prices. We have no energy policy until recently. Why? Because of the power and the money spent by fossil fuels. Why don't we have good gun laws in this country? Because of the power of the gun lobby. So the corrupting influence of money in our political system has impacted the ability of Congress to get its work done and to enact laws that protect the interests of the American people in very significant ways. One of the ways I think you fix that is you create a new way for financing campaigns, a public financing model, and get corporate money and get secret money out of our political system completely. Dark corporate secret money that can be spent in political campaigns is corrupting our system. That's first thing. Second thing is I think you need to have a lot more transparency so people know where money is coming from in these cases. And, we have to be sure that people understand the impact of these things. And then finally, we need to have some reforms in the rules of the Senate to get rid of the Senate filibuster so that the actual majority of the Senate rules. And so right now, the rules of the Senate allow 10 members of the minority to overrule the will of the majority because of this 60 vote requirement. That's not in the Constitution. There's no good reason for it. It's fundamentally undemocratic, and it lets the minority, in this case, the Republicans, overrule the will of the majority. We passed universal background checks. We passed the Equality Act. We passed the Voting Rights Act. We passed the John Lewis Act. All those bills, which could pass a simple majority in the House, but we can't get 10 Republicans. So we're letting the Republicans stop this progress, and it's undermining people's confidence in democracy in this country. It's undemocratic. And by the way, when you look at the United States Senate, by design, it's already undemocratic because you have these very small red states with small populations that have a disproportionate representation in the Senate. All these red states have 2 senators, just like California, that has 40 million, 50 million people. So there's already a tremendous overrepresentation of the far right in the design of the Senate today. And then you layer on top of it the filibuster, and you make a mockery of democracy.
And also, I think one of the things that frustrates people on the left, or Democrats, progressives, whatever you want to call it, all the names, is that it seems whenever Republicans are in charge, if they don't like the rules, they change it.
Oh, and by the way,
Mitch
they did.
McConnell is...
And by the way, they did. When Mitch McConnell didn't like what was happening with the Supreme Court, they got rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court so they could have a simple majority to jam their members onto the court. People are absolutely right. When the rules need to be changed for the Republicans to maximize their power, they did it. And I agree. I think we have, as a party, have not done that. I mean, I don't have any control over the Senate. I'm in the House. But I have been arguing for a long time that the Senate needs to change its rules and give the majority the ability to actually enact its policies. And when people say, well, what happens when we're in the minority? You know what happens? We work really hard to go back into the majority. We show the American people the difference between their policies and ours, and we earn the right to go back into the majority. That's the way democracies work.
Right.
This like secret system of 60 vote threshold, which basically nobody understands. Like the average person thinks, Democrats at the House, the Senate, the White House, why aren't all these things happening? Oh, well, we have this rule. Like, it's just indefensible in my view. And we ought to make the Senate more democratic by making sure that whoever it wins the majority has the ability to actually pass that agenda with, some confidence that that's what the American people elected them to do.
Okay. And then speaking of the Republican Party, it has undergone significant changes in the recent years. And many people that I know on the right or Republicans are actually considering leaving the party because they don't like the leadership or the representation. What has been your experience in your tenure there, working with the other side, working with some of the people on the far right, the Matt Gaetz, the Lindsey Graham, Marjorie Taylor Greene?
I don't think the Republican Party has an identity any more different from Donald Trump. The reason that's true is in the last presidential election, when they were required to nominate a candidate and develop a platform, which is the platform tells you what your priorities are. The Republican Party didn't have a platform. They decided that the Republican Party was whatever Donald Trump said it was. I mean, think about that. This is a major political party in this country. They had no party platform for the presidential campaign. And so I think the Republican Party has become Donald Trump. And so it is a measurement of your allegiance to him. If you don't have loyalty to him, you're not really a member of the Republican Party. And I think it's going to mean ultimately the end of the Republican Party, which will be a good thing because it needs to rebuild itself.
Right.
And I think until it's completely at the bottom, which I think it will be very soon, we need a Republican Party. We need a two-party system where Republicans can challenge the ideas of the Democrats, where they can offer their own ideas. Like, that's healthy for our democracy.
Right.
But we don't have a functioning Republican Party right now. We have the party of Donald Trump. And I think the sooner the Republicans realize that's a dead end, and the sooner they begin the hard work of rebuilding the party, the better it will be for them and the better it will be for the country.
And so, lastly, you're one of the few people who got into office and is voluntarily leaving to go do something else. Could you elaborate on why you made this decision? And is there any, should we anticipate future run for Senate, for president, governor, something?
Well, first I would say is I have been in Congress for 12 years. I have loved every minute of it. It has been the greatest honor of my life to represent Rhode Island and Washington. And I hope if people look objectively at my work, they will see that I did my job and I worked hard for Rhode Island. The opportunity presented itself to be the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Foundation, which is one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country. And I saw it as an opportunity to continue to do all the work I've been doing in education and economic development and healthcare, but do it in a setting where I could benefit the whole state and also where I could really see the results of the work I was doing and kind of compare that to what I think is going to happen in the House in the next few years. And I saw this as an opportunity to go to a place where I could get a lot of things done and do it in a state that I loved. And so I was excited to be given this opportunity. And, for my focus is to be sure I'm the best president and CEO the Rhode Island Foundation has ever had and to do really good work. And that's what I'm going to do. And, I think I've been in elective office for almost half my life, almost 30 years. So.
Well, congratulations on everything that you've done, and we wish you luck on your next steps.
Thank you so much.
It's just tough, and we look forward to continue to serve with you.